So you're about to go out on tour and you're debating whether or not it's worth touring a front of house console. Budget's tight, you're playing smaller venues, and in terms of breaking even or making a profit on the tour, if you can cut expenses in certain areas, then potentially that's worthwhile. But equally at the same time, you want it to be a good level of production, you want the shows to run smoothly, and for people just to have an easy time if they can, and have a fun time. So, whatever you can do to minimize stresses and just make sure things run smoothly, that's also an important consideration. Now, I've toured, small venues and then larger kind of club size venues up to like a few thousand capacity. And I've done so touring consoles and then also using venue consoles. And I think there are reasons to tour a console and also to not tour a console. If we're talking like a relatively straightforward 4-piece guitar band, say, where the production level isn't overly complicated, you're doing small venues, you're using the venue PA, the venue monitors, so the band aren't on in-ear monitors, you're doing monitors from front of house, but it's a standard 4-piece guitar band, 2 guitars, bass, drums, a couple of vocals, that sort of thing. So it's a relatively straightforward sound. So from a front of house sound perspective, it's very easy to build a show file for that every night, and you don't necessarily need to have one prepped in advance because you've not got a huge channel count and you're not really having to go to town in terms of the processing, just a bit of EQ, compression where needed, and some gating. It's a pretty straightforward mix. It's pretty easy to build that from scratch every night, and to do that on any console a venue might have. And then with using the house monitors, if you're driving monitors from front of house, the venue monitors, every venue, the gain structure is going to be different. The sound of those monitors are going to be different. So there'd really be no point having a show file where you've got wedge levels dialed in, because the wedges are going to be completely different every night. So those levels in your show file aren't really going to be relative to anything. In the same sense as that, if you're using venue microphones, then of course you're at the mercy of whatever the venue has. And sure, no pun intended, the venues you're going to be touring are going to have a lot of your standard Shure SM57s, SM58s, maybe Sennheiser drum mics, your sort of standard go-tos. So you'll know what to expect to a degree, and you might be able to dial in some EQs with those expectations of what mics you'll have in mind. But yeah, you don't know what mics you're going to be using. It's not the same as touring your own mics. So again, there's little point to having like EQs and stuff dialed in, because you're really going to be doing that differently every night anyway. So other than having your channel list laid out on the board, which, if you've got a relatively low channel count, it's a pretty simple, straightforward setup. It's not going to take you hours to patch that into the console and label your channels. We're talking minutes that it takes to do that. So if you're looking at that kind of tour, then I think there aren't that many benefits to touring a console. Don't get me wrong, there's another side to it. In terms of reliability, of course, if you're going into venues and using their console, you don't know what the state of that console is going to be, if it's got any dodgy fader motors, any dead inputs, any buttons sticking, anything like that, or, who knows, a total console failure in the middle of your show, which you don't want that to happen. And that could just as easily happen if you're touring a console. These kind of failures, like power supply failures, that kind of thing, it does happen. And I'd say it's probably just as likely to happen with a console you'd tour as opposed to a venue console. But yeah, if you're touring a console, particularly if you're hiring a console from a hire company, it's going to be in immaculate condition, well serviced. You know that there's a level of reliability there, as long as you're transporting it safely. It's in a flight case, it's well protected. You're going to have a pristine console every night, whereas if you're going to venues and using their console. Like I say, you don't know what to expect. That's an important consideration, how much that matters to you. Personally, I don't mind too much. Again, if I've got a pretty simple show and a relatively low channel count, if there's a dodgy fader or two on the board, then, I can just ignore those and work around that. Some sticking buttons or dodgy encoders, it can be a little bit annoying, but generally, as long as the console works, I'm fairly forgiving when it comes to that kind of stuff. But at the same time, it is nice to have a reliable console where you know what to expect. And also you're using the same console every night, even if you are building a show file from scratch every show. Just using the same console can be a nice thing because, again, you know what to expect and you get used to the workflow of the console and how it sounds, most importantly. So let's talk about pros for taking a console on the road with you. I think primarily the real benefit comes from touring a console when you have a very self-contained production. So if your budget is tight, then this may not be an option for you. Touring your own mic package and then touring your own band backline as well. That way, in essence, the only variable each night is going to be the venue, the acoustics of the room that you're in, and the PA system that you're working with. Everything else, your console, your line system, your microphones, and your instruments on stage, and obviously your musicians, it's going to be the same every night. You can have a show file dialed in with EQs and compression and effects and whatever else. In theory, when you're using the same microphones, the same stuff every night, it's going to largely sound the same. Of course, backline's going to be influenced by the acoustics of the room, especially acoustic instruments like drums, but the sound is going to be largely the same. And so in theory, all you really need to do is just tweak your EQ on your mains, and then sort of tune your mix to the sound of that system, if that makes sense. So that's usually what I find myself largely doing after pre-production and so many shows into the tour. I've got the mix pretty dialed in, and then when it comes to sound check each day, I can load up the show file from the previous night and then just change the EQ on my left, right, or my main outputs, just tweak that so that it sounds right with the PA, the mix sounds right, and then I don't need to do a whole lot in terms of VQs and stuff on my mix. I just, might need to adjust level balances a bit, but in theory, it's about as consistent as you can get. So you need to do a lot less with the mix each night. It's also particularly helpful when you're driving in-ear mixes from front of house. Again, if you've got the same console, mics and everything, that sound is going to be very consistent for the band on stage. So you can have in-ear levels dialed in and have that saved on your show file and load that up each day in sound check, and you're going to find that you'll need to do very little tweaking. So it just gets you where you need to be a lot quicker and just means that you have a more consistent sound. So things are more likely going to be right for the musicians in their ears, and you're just not going to need to spend as much time sound checking and tweaking stuff. So that's a huge benefit in my eyes. Your mileage will vary a lot depending on the complexity of your production. Like I say, if this is a simple 4-piece guitar band, this is quicker to dial in and get where you need to without having all of this stuff on the road with you. But if it's a more complex production where, I don't know, maybe you're running lots of track, you've got a brass section or a string section, or just, a lot more happening on stage, a higher channel count, it's going to make life a lot easier if you can make things as consistent as they possibly can be. And you just eliminate a lot of setup time so that you can focus on really dialing in the sound and getting the mix right. And you're not having to spend ages patching things, laying out your console, and dialing in you know, all your initial EQs and stuff, you know, and all the little things as well, like your gains, your gain structure. If you're using the same mics every night, that's something you're really not going to have to touch much at all once you've got that dialed in, because your gain structure is always going to be the same because you've got the same console preamps and the same microphones. The only thing that might vary there is the level of your source going into those mics. So say for a guitar amp, the stage volume one night needed to be turned up more because of how the venue is, but then the next night it needs to come down, and then you need to crank the gain on the mic preamp a bit more. But other than that, yeah, you should largely be set a lot of the time, so it really makes life a lot easier. So I think those are the kind of main pros and cons either way for whether or not to tour a console. And ultimately, I think it boils down to whether or not you can tour a whole production, so console, mics, and backline. If you can do that, then I think it's definitely worthwhile touring a console. If you can't tour one of those things, then, I mean, I'd argue you'd be better off touring a mic package and backline and having those things consistent and using venue consoles over touring a console but not having a mic package or not having band backline. So yeah, hopefully that's given you some food for thought. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel. That helps me out a lot and I'd really appreciate it. And I'll see you again in the next video.